couple people can join in.
All right, welcome everyone. I am super excited to jump into this webinar that we're hosting with Dwellsy. They're one of our newer partners, and we're really excited to dive into their data and learn a ton more about how the data is sourced, some of the research use cases, and just go super deep and also have a chance to answer some questions with the Dwellsy team. Before I introduce them though and dive in, just a couple quick housekeeping items on the Dewey side. This session is being recorded, and so you don't have to frantically take notes. We will automatically send the recording to anyone who's registered. And so feel free to pass this along to any colleagues that maybe weren't able to attend live as well. And I definitely encourage the use of the Q&A or the chat feature. My colleague Kelly will be here kind of monitoring the chat. I'll be looking at it as well once I hand it off to the team. And we will definitely want to get your questions answered. I'll kind of be the moderator too. So Jim and Jonas, I might kind of interrupt you and ask questions that come up that are timely so that we're not all, saving them for the end, just to keep the discussion moving. So yeah, let's introduce the Dwellsy team. So we have Jonas, who's the CEO and co-founder of Dwellsy, and Jim, who's the VP of Sales. They'll be taking on this kind of the majority of this presentation as we dive into the data sets and learn more. Like I said, they're new partners. We're very excited to have them on the Dewey platform. When we are looking at adding new data vendors, we're always very particular about the partners that we add. We do our own vetting, making sure that they're obviously high quality data sources. And I think what really stood out about this team is the quality of the data sourcing that goes into this robust data set that they now have to support like the rental market and a lot of other research that you can do with that. And so they had a unique approach to sourcing this data, which really I think will allow it to stand out when you think about a lot of the applications in the research setting. And so it was kind of a no-brainer to partner with this team. And I think we were just talking before this call. I think we're just both excited about bringing this data to the market and seeing all the different research applications and use cases that are going to be made possible by this partnership. So I'm really excited to introduce the team. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and kick it off to you. I think most users here are probably, most folks on this call are probably already Dewey users, but if you're not, you can certainly create an account to follow along and kind of browse the data sets. And then also see our documentation, which now lives in the app itself. And so if you are a user and want to follow along as we're talking about these data sets, feel free to log in. And with that, I will turn it over to Jim and Jonas.
All right. Thank you so much, Evan. I'm Jonas. It's very nice to meet you all. Excited to be here with my colleague, Jim. We are incredibly excited about the use of Dwellsy data in an academic environment. We've worked with a lot of different academics across the years of developing the data set. And one of the things that we've seen over and over again is the fact that there just hasn't been functional rent data available in this space. But there's been a lot of interest in exploring this sector of the economy, this sector of society. And so we're really excited to be able to facilitate that. As Evan mentioned, happy to answer any questions as we go through. We've got some slides prepared, and we'll jump in. So with that, where did this all start? About 7, 8 years ago, I was a practitioner in the industry. I managed apartments for one of the big real estate investment trusts. And we had this problem that our revenue management system, which was the system that helped us pick prices for all the rentals, was always wrong. And as we dug into that over and over and over at deeper levels, we realized that the foundational problem was not the nature of the system itself, but the underlying data, which was collected poorly and it was the wrong data points that were collected. And it was kind of a shock to all of us on the system, all of us in the business there, to realize that the actual data that was foundational for our business, for every business in that space, was incorrect. Why was that incorrect? Well, it's mostly sourced in 3 different ways. There's scraping, which doesn't work for a bunch of different reasons. Primarily because it's incredibly fragmented industry. There are literally millions of websites that feature prices. Those websites are all in different formats. It's incredibly difficult to scrape them at the best of times. And even if you can't get the actual rent. The rent is displayed on those sites in an iterative basis. The rent, the discovery process for the landlords is actually done in public. So the landlord will typically start with one price and then adjust price 5, 6, 7, 8 times before they settle on the final price. And that final asking rent, about 95% of the time, is what the renter pays on their lease and throughout the duration of their time at that rental. But if you're capturing and scraping that data earlier, you're not going to capture the right rent number. You're going to capture a preliminary rent number. So that's scraping surveys. Famously, if you ask people about a number, your odds of getting an accurate result are pretty low in this situation, particularly if you call a property manager who's busy and doesn't have any incentive to answer your question accurately. You're going to get at best a guess as to what the right number is. And you can't call them every day. You can't call them certainly 100 times a day. You have to call them maybe every 6 months at best. So it's going to be old and it's going to be incorrect. And then the government indices that are out there have just not been able to replicate the actual real rent numbers. They're all heavily lagged, reliant on human reporting, and ultimately, as we've heard from many, too coarse for most research. Um, we're very happy to be working with the Federal Reserve as one of our earliest academic oriented partners. And I always think of this quote from one of the researchers there. They likened it to what they'd had to do if they were not able to check grocery store prices, that they're just asking consumers what the groceries in their pantry are worth. And as you can imagine, you're not going to get a very accurate answer to that question. Dwellsy is the literal equivalent of actually being able to check the prices in the grocery store for the first time. Um, so what's in the data set? It is, first of all, as comprehensive as any data set that's ever been assembled in this space. We've got primarily professionally managed rentals, and we've got about 70% of them. So over 17 million units rent using Dwellsy when they're available. So it's not 17 million available units at any given time. At any given time, there's going to be a subset of those 17 million that are actually available, but 17 plus million units will show their available rentals and prices on the Dwellsy system when they've got that. We cover virtually the entire country, and all of this is coming from more than 25,000 professional property managers. Really important to mention here that as you look across the whole industry, there's about 110 million renters, 46 million rental households, and about half of those are professionally managed. Materially, all of Dwellsy's inventory is from the professionally managed rentals. And so we've got about 70%, 75% of those 17 million out of the 23 million professionally managed rentals on the platform. And with that, I'll turn over to Jim.
Thank you, Jonas. So just going into kind of like the genesis of our data, little prop tech 101 and why this matters. As you start on the lower left side of the screen, you're going to see 30 plus PMS data integrations. Those are those property management software solutions that Jonas mentioned. These are solutions built for real estate. Companies like Yardi or solutions like Yardi, Entrata, Appfolio, which you might be aware of. These are core ERP, back office financials, as well as the front office property management and operations. So these companies will build out their portfolio literally, like the buildings, the units, and that all flows into the financial side of the business. With that, they have a variety of different ancillary solutions to it. It could be rent payments, rent screening, utility billing, et cetera, that they sell. But they also have partnership programs, different integrations that they offer. We are partners with the companies that you're seeing here, as well as several others, over 30 interfaces. Basically, you sign up, do the paperwork, you are given an API being an application protocol interface. It is a unique data set based upon your use. So for us, being an ILS, an internet listing service, Dwellsy.com, a rental marketplace, we are privy to that API. And so once we are part of that partnership, any user of these platforms, Yardi, Entrata, Buildium, ResMan, Rent Manager, they can choose in that platform to say, when I've got an available unit, where do I want to list it among a variety of different providers? So I'm going to pause there and say that with Appfolio, when I mentioned the choice, with Appfolio, we have an arrangement where we actually get every single unit that is managed on Appfolio contractually. So their client base, as part of the contractual agreement, we get every single one of those rentals. In Yardi and Entrata, the property management companies need to kind of like throw a switch in the back end to say, yes, when it's available, list it there. 7 years ago, when we started Dwellsy, we went out and hit the marketplace and said, "Hey guys, we are the only 100% free ILS or marketplace." Quite unusual. The other providers, apartments.com, Zillow, you name it, monetize based on listings. So they charge the property management company and or leads that they provide. So you can imagine as a property management company, you might look and say, okay, where do I want to list? Dwellsy, no brainer, it's totally free. Apartments.com, Zillow, I got to pay for it. Okay, if I'm maybe a larger entity, investment grade, institutional grade, yeah, I will list on apartments.com. They do Super Bowl ads. They've got, I can never remember the actor's name who plays that goofy professor in their commercials. They've got a big presence, but they might not list everything on apartments.com as well. They might just list generic information. This property has these, one bedroom has this rent range, this sort of thing. So not only did we get a large volume of listings when we first hit the market and said we were 100% free, during the pandemic, we exponentially grew our listings base and database because obviously reasonably everybody was very concerned about making sure that they kept their listings out there and that they were available to rentals. So hence the reason why we say we've got about 5 to 6 years of really good, robust data. During the pandemic, we saw that hockey stick effect of a lot of an adoption. So let me talk about the PMS providers and why it's important for our data set in terms of our coverage of not only just saying 17 million plus units on Dwellsy. Yardi plays in the investment grade, institutional grade is a more expensive solution. They do have the biggest footprint in that space, but you're going to find it is property management companies that manage typically 5,000 units and above. Yardi's expensive. You can configure it. There's a lot of consulting involved, but it has some great things from an investment management standpoint. If you've got a sophisticated investment structure and you want to make sure you can flow everything into kind of disbursement for different percentage ownership and that sort of thing. Entrada plays in the same space, not as big a footprint, but it's always going to be in that kind of like higher level institutional investment grade and maybe is missing on some of the smaller property managers or secondary markets or tertiary markets. AppFolio plays in that segment. Their typical client is managing 500 units. They do have some smaller, but 500 units up to 15,000 units. And so they're really capturing a big segment of the market that others don't capture. We're fortunate enough to have this partnership where we get that data because even as it relates to rental data in the industry, if you were to go to some of the major providers of rental data like a CoStar or Cotality, they are not monitoring that segment of the rental marketplace because they're trying to provide data to investors, acquisitions, dispositions, asset managers. It's not as relevant to them to monitor that kind of like secondary tier of the space, as we like to refer to it, the long tail. So again, broad coverage, but also not only just in terms of numbers, but also getting a more complete picture of the rental ecosphere. Those listings then post to Dwellsy. Before they go into our data set, we do data cleansing. One of the things we do is, for example, removing duplicative listings. Chicago has a lot of brokerage, so we will get a listing directly from a property management company that is managing that unit. We might get 2 listings from 2 different brokers for that unit. Those listings will go up on Dwellsy, but before they go in the data set, we will cleanse that. We will remove those duplicative listings saying this is the listing of record. We know it's a property management company. That asking rent is the most accurate. The data in that is the most accurate. We will then normalize data, verify it. In the interest of time, I won't go into all the detail on that. And then we will enrich the data. We will add things like, as one example, a lat long at the unit level. This becomes important as you look at larger communities where the property address, you've got a large community where the unit is actually located quite a ways away, and maybe you're trying to do a study from a geo standpoint, and so the literal leasing address or property address is not as important as knowing where is that unit located. So once we do all that, that really informs and populates the Dwellsy IQ database, which you now have access to via Dewey. Jonas, if you could go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about stats in terms of our coverage again.
Hey Jim, you mind if I chime in? Actually, I've already learned something. It's a nuance that I've uncovered based on how you communicated that I wanted to make sure was like communicated and passed through. So I think to me, when I heard professionally managed as kind of like the subset of units that we're talking about, my brain actually made the incorrect jump to like institutional owners. I was thinking about these like large hedge funds that own. This is clearly not true in how the data is sourced because I'm thinking about for myself, we actually do have an investment property. our property managers, I'm just an individual owner on one property, so I'm not an institutional investor, but our property managers use AppFolio. So therefore, even though I'm just a single owner of this investment property, it will still show up in the database, which I think was important for me to understand. So when we think about, researchers may be concerned about bias in the data, it's not only units that are owned by institutional large owners.
That is very accurate. And, where we don't potentially, and really, quite honestly, it'd be difficult for anybody to have the data is we say professionally managed in this scenario you're talking about. When you talk about a mom and pop, for lack of a better term, like if you know somebody, let's say that Evan, you own that property, but you manage it yourself, you most likely wouldn't put it out on a marketing website. You might just put a sign on the lawn. You might do word of mouth. Maybe you would do some platforms like Zillow where people are allowed to maybe pay a small fee and list one or two rentals. Again, the integrity of that data is questionable, but yes, thank you for highlighting that. We do believe that is a significant value in our data set to have that coverage. So moving on, again, over 17 million rental units across every long-term rental type. So we've got very robust coverage of SFR as well as multifamily, also including some mobile home. 350,000 live listing at any given time. So live data set, you will see active versus inactive, covering over 800 metros, over 16,000 zip codes with 300,000 daily updates. So we're continually getting these updates from the property management software systems, which also leads to the ability to see how rents are changing during the listing phase of a unit. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. And so our first earliest record goes back to 2020. Probably January 21 is when we think we've got a robust enough data set that is actionable. Next slide, Jonas. So let's talk about the granular data points. I know Evan pointed out that you can actually follow along within the Dewey platform. From a pricing standpoint, we will have final asking rent. So when you see that a unit is inactive and you see that rent there, that is a final asking rent at the time it was inactive. If you see that it's still active, that's the asking rent at that point. Again, you can track that to see how that changes. The list history and changes. You will see concession signals in the feed, the standard MITS feed, which is an industry standard. Concessions is not currently broken out as a discrete data point. We expect that to change as the government has put more and more pressure for transparency in all of the fees and all the pricing, which we 100% support. Nonetheless, in our data set, many times in the narrative, people will put concessions or additional fees, especially companies that are very sensitive to that from past actions against them. So make sure to look in that narrative. You can call some insights from that. And then you'll see days on market, which is one of my favorite, which nobody's going to have accurately. You're going to see exactly when it listed. You're going to see exactly when it deactivated. And you will be able, so you can even do research where you're saying, just looking at how rents are changing might not speak to a market. Is it taking a little bit longer to rent a unit? Is it taking a shorter period of time to rent a unit? How are people adjusting their rent? So that's one of my favorite data points, nerding out on that. A bunch of property information, amenity information that could be interesting. And Jonas is going to talk about examples of research later on. You could delve into those for different ways to analyze. And then when we mention condition and photography, in the data set, you will have a hyperlink to the actual listing, even if it's not still on Dwellsy.com. So it might have been listed 2 years ago. We retain all of those historic listing and all of those visual images. You can use those as you see fit. We, for example, as AI has become more affordable and more powerful, we're doing some work to try and cull data from those visual images. And if we've all got experience with Claude and other tools, it's amazing what we can do. You can start to actually find different things from the photo data set to create your own data points to inform your research. Next slide, and I might be handing it back to you. I'm not sure yet. So I'll hand it to Jonas to talk about kind of research ideas.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Jim. So we put together a few different ideas here. We've talked to a lot of researchers over the course of the last few years of working with this data. And we've seen a bunch of different themes. I think, really broadly, keeping in mind that this represents the largest expense for about a third of American households. There's a lot of different directions you could go in. So folks are using it to understand the American economy, looking for correlations with other asset classes, thinking about the behaviors of people within this universe. I think one of the first published studies using our data was looking at the behavior of landlords and whether or not they were behaving appropriately vis-a-vis racial or ethnic profiling of prospective tenants. So there's a lot of different directions you can go in with this, and we've assembled a few just to give you some ideas. This is the first, there's a lot of different interesting patterns of comparison within the data set. So there's multiple different asset classes. There's single family rentals, which is getting a lot of press right now. About 40% of the US rental inventory is single family homes. So that's a big chunk of our data set, as you would imagine. So being able to look at different markets, how they're performing in different ways, and how big events have affected them. COVID was an enormous event from a rent standpoint. It hit rents in very different ways in very different places. This is just one illustration of how it hit San Francisco very differently than cities like Austin or Boise. So that's one idea. Another one, looking within markets and across different property types, you can see the behavior of 3 bedrooms and 1 bedrooms have been very, very different. Apartments have not seen material rent gains over the last few years. 1 bedroom apartments, it's been more or less flat during this entire time. 3 bedroom houses, on the other hand, have gotten much more expensive. And actually, we've seen a gap emerge between single family houses, which have, on a secular basis, gotten dramatically more expensive than apartments. I don't know why that is. It's a very interesting repositioning of where Americans want to live and what they're valuing. But this is representative of that type of research. This is one that we're incredibly excited about. We know of a few groups who are working on this. People have always wanted to know what the amenities are worth. What is air conditioning worth in Phoenix versus Chicago? What is a dishwasher worth? What are people willing to pay a premium for, and what are they not willing to pay a premium for? Is there a premium associated with being able to have your dog at that community versus another community that might not allow that? So for the first time, there's a data set that can actually help you explain that at a scaled level that has enough data in every market in the country to be able to not just do it on a national basis, but also compare within markets. So this is a really exciting direction for research. This leading versus lagging question is a really interesting one, and I've talked to a couple of researchers who are thinking about this one. Is Dwellsy's data, is this rent data, a leading indicator of where things are going? If you think about shelter CPI, rent is a material proportion of actual shelter CPI, but it's never been measurable before now. The Fed is incorporating it into its internal measurements of CPI as it's calculating its own numbers. But the traditional measures of CPI have not incorporated a valid rent amount. Their rent amount tends to be 6 to 12 months or more out of date and likely incorrect. So do we have a leading indicator in the Dwellsy data? We might. We're not quite sure yet, but I know folks are interested in looking at this one. Lastly, the rental market has been examined in cities to some degree, but it's very rarely been examined in other places. Dwellsy's data, because of the depth and breadth, not only do we go across more than 800 MSAs across the country, but we also get into rural areas, suburban areas to a greater depth than has ever been available before. And so there's some interesting possibilities when you start thinking about how the rental market compares in different places based on population density, based on nature and character of those different communities. Lots of different areas that you can go with that.
Yeah, and just a quick comment on that, Jonas, as you're well aware, it's funny every time we had government, Montana came to us, some segment of their economic, the government organization, and just immediately we're like, well, you're not going to have Montana data, and I said, I'm not going to tell you that we've got a ton of Montana data, but we're probably going to have a pretty good representation, and they were impressed and actually signed up with us recently. Ditto for Minnesota, where they wanted to even get into rural areas. So those of you who are interested in kind of exploring that beyond the metros, most definitely dive into the data set. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised with what kind of coverage we have. So who uses Dwellsy data today? Let's jump right next to the next slide, do a little flexing. So as Jonas had mentioned, the Fed uses it for research, for informing monetary policy. Very happy to be working with them. I think they're The ways they were gathering that information might have been a little outdated, but they came across a couple of years ago and happy to have that. Can't share some of the things we've heard, but pretty exciting things. My own Fed here in Cleveland has got a pretty cool research project they're doing, leveraging the photos. They're very excited about that. First American uses us for rental AVM, among other things. Moody's Analytics uses us for real estate research and their publications. In terms of academic research, and again, Jonas and I can't say enough how happy we are about this partnership with Dewey. Jonas has been passionate from the day I started with Dwellsy years ago, wanting to get our data in front of academic research. It's so difficult to scale to do the outreach to the universities and reach the right people. Here are a few examples where we did reach, not surprisingly, Chicago Booth, since Jonas is a Boothie himself, was unfamiliar with that term until a short while ago. So it was a little easy to get in touch with them. Wisconsin-Madison, University of British Columbia. I'm going to give a shout out to their faculty member who I hope did attend. I know they were registered, so thank you for your partnership there. And then within the industry, we are really used broadly in prop tech solutions. Companies like Crexy that does a geospatial mapping of real estate locations, different demographics, these sorts of things, for acquisitions, dispositions for real estate companies, development, kind of researching where they should develop, all sorts of things like that. Elise AI, which is a prominent AI platform that has just taken the real estate industry by storm. So they're using our data to train their AI models, their AI leasing agents, as well as a variety of other things. And AppFolio that is using our data to inform their revenue management solution. So I think I might have one more here, Jonas, before I kick it back to you. So just kind of bringing it home here as we do come to the end, and hopefully folks have got some questions that they'd like to ask. I think we've left plenty of time. So just thinking about the options besides Dwellsy, I'm actually going to start with surveys, and I'm going to do that because I've been in the industry long enough to remember when surveys were the standard. So there was a time when property managers, as part of their job, would call other property managers at comparable communities, and say, "Hey, Susie, what's your one bedroom, two bedroom? Hey, Roger, what's your one bedroom, two bedroom?" And if they had a good rapport, they would honestly share with one another. If they didn't, people would know, okay, you're secret shopping me. I'm going to give you a bogus number. Either way, it was always, what's a one bedroom, one bath? It's not like with Dwellsy where you're going, this is the unit and this is what the pricing is. So again, self-reported and often wrong, as Jonas mentioned, just human nature. What's the lag? How often are they doing that? From a legal standing, we mentioned legal standing because there was a company that came out with a platform that took the old calling people and said, we're going to stand up a platform where property managers can just enter in their rents. And it's kind of that show me yours, I'll show you mine. If you take part in this group, if you put your information in, then you can see other people's. Understandably, the DOJ said that's kind of a no-no. That leads to price collusion. It's a cornerstone of many of the suits they had, many of the class action suits, that you're sharing information with one another and it can inform your pricing, especially proprietary. Again, with Dwellsy's data, it's all presented in the marketplace. We have first party rights cleared on it. Our clients know it's the Google Play. We're providing a service for free. We can resell your data. And then those surveys are typically metro aggregate. For scrape listings, they're partial. They could miss the final price. They don't scrape the last day it's listed. Freshness is inconsistent. How often are they scraping? Legal standing, there are a lot of questions about can you actually list websites and how you do that. This is going to be really interesting to see how it plays out and to see if and how the government starts to come into the play of the legality of that and how they start to put guardrails around it. And then it is typically the top metros only. One other comment on that, I touched on it earlier too. Listing sites, you don't know that they are effective actual listings that are taking place now. This is something we come up against a lot. People are used to these standard listing sites and question why we maybe don't have as many listings. Again, we've done research. We've had prospective clients do research and find over 50% are not actual listings. It's just a broker trying to get a lead in. So just kind of to finalize it, Dwellsy, like your final asking rent, exact, real time, first party rights cleared with a broad set of coverage. And I think the last two were just kind of like, bringing it home that we're very happy with this. Jonas, I'll actually let you bring it home with the last slide and kind of talking about how important it is for you, this kind of bringing this to research.
Yeah, so a couple of different things just to summarize. One, we're just incredibly excited to finally have an accurate data set in this category. There's a third of Americans who live this lived experience of renting, and this is their biggest expense. And nobody's really been able to look at that and study that previously because the data was so poor, that it really wasn't worth their time. That has changed. It is now available and people can use it. As we've mentioned many times, we're very excited as a partnership with Dewey because it makes this data easily accessible to a lot of researchers across the country. So we're thrilled that you all have access. Um, we are very happy to collaborate with you if you have questions, want to talk through the data, want to think through how you might analyze it. I know the Dewey folks have come up to speed quickly on all of our data, but they can also put you in touch with us. Jim or I would be happy to help you out. And we're always curious what people are working on with the data, so we'd love to hear about it. And if we can be helpful in any way, please don't hesitate. Yeah, you bring the research question, you bring a ton of data. So I guess that opens the door for questions. Um, please.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you so much. That was a ton to unpack there. And it was super insightful. Again, I think I learned a ton. So I actually have a couple of questions of my own too. But I also do very much appreciate the offer. I'll reiterate again how excited the Dewey team is about this partnership. And especially because, Jim, Jonas, and their team has been super leaned in again to support the research use cases. And that offer to help is not an offer we get from every vendor. So I appreciate your willingness to lean in there. And then just one other personal note, as some other questions come in on the on the rental property experience. We had, even again, we don't have a ton of properties. We had a property, but we found that someone had actually cloned our listing as a scam and put it on Zillow. And now there's two duplicative listings on there. Long story short, we ended up, yeah, basically someone broke into the house, changed the locks, and said, "This is my listing. I'm, hosting this, blah blah blah." And so I'm sure that the quality of that listed data and the scrape data from those listings is, questionable at best. So I really, again, when we made the decision to continue the conversations with Dwellsy, I think it was clear that the quality of the sourcing and the way that you source the data is definitely a huge advantage when it comes to needing high quality data for research.
Yeah. That Evan, it's a really interesting point you make because that is the number one source of rental data on the open market right now is fraud.
Mhm.
Full stop. Most websites, you look at Craigslist, 95 to 98% of the listings there are fraudulent. They happen exactly as you described. We call it the fake landlord scam. The average renter, we did a survey bunch of years ago, probably wouldn't stand up to academic rigor, but we talked to about 500 renters, and 22% of them had been defrauded in their rental search. The average loss was almost $3,000.
Yeah.
It's really horrible out there for renters and for landlords. There's a lot of renter fraud as well. That's what took down the Craigslist rental marketplace.
Yep.
That's really problematic. We work very hard to keep all of that off our platform.
Awesome. All right. Well, let me work through some of these questions. And I guess the first one I see is kind of more about, I guess, the attributes that are in the data at a high level,
Mhm.
but generally asking about observed, date approved, date built, first TCOs, unit deliveries. So I think it's just kind of curious what's observable in that data for a given listing in terms of the type of attributes that are going to be most interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you think of our data, you should think of what a rental listing looks like. So it's going to have photos, it's going to have, the core characteristics of the building, bedrooms, bathrooms, or the unit rather, bedrooms, bathrooms, does it have stainless steel appliances? Does it have, what kind of countertops does it have? Those sorts of things. There's also some metadata associated with it. Jim made a really good point about this, and it's true. One of the most valuable aspects of our data is that you can see when the listing came on market and when it came off market. So that's an example of metadata that's in there that we're providing. The rent price, we will give the price as it's changing live. And so you can see that during the offering period. And then once the listing is closed, you see the final asking rent, which is basically the market rent. We haven't talked about why final asking rent, but perhaps we should. I'll go into that in a second. One last piece of what's in the data set is incredibly accurate addresses. Most rental apartments in particular do not have accurate addresses. Most of them are mapped to the leasing office. We've done the work of actually rooftop geocoding those, and that's proved to be very important for a lot of the research done with our data. I do want to just mention the final asking rent. Why final asking rent? Well, certainly you don't want to pick up the rent earlier in the process before the asking rent, the final asking rent has been established. So why not contracted rent? Contracted rent is extremely problematic because it contains massive outliers. So in my own experience, I ran a portfolio of 60,000 apartments, and we found about 94% of renters signed leases at the final asking rent. The 6% that were not signed at the final asking rent sometimes varied by up to 100%. People would pay double the normal rent for a 3-month lease, for a 5-month lease, because they had a really unusual situation that they were living, 5 big dogs or 10 people living in an apartment. There were some quirky situations that were willing to accommodate for the right price. And so those 6% that did not sign at the final asking rent deviated massively. And it's very hard to tease those out and know what is market and what is not once you're at that contracted rent. Plus, it's emerged that that's both PII and collusion, so very hard to collect that data anymore. So the real data point you want is that final asking rent.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go real quick, rapid fire too on Dama's questions because he or she has a bunch in here. So we don't have data outside of we do have some examples. So you say date built, that's something that's not inherently in our data set. We populate that with county records. It might be provided by the property management company, or we'll populate it with county records. It is not in every single record. The things you're asking, like first TCOs, unit deliveries, like future deliveries, that sort of thing, we do not bring any of those data sets. Like when we will see a new property come on our platform. And quite honestly, Jonas, please, correct me if you have a different insight. We don't observe and say, where'd that come from? Is that a new development? It could just as soon be that a property management company took over property management from a different property management company that wasn't listening with us and it came on. So we're not going to have a lot of those other aspects that you're looking for. That's not going to be in our data set.
We will see lease ups come on. So a lease up is a new community that's being offered for the first time. And that has that has a unique flag associated with it, which they'll make 50 units available all simultaneously, which does not happen organically in the real world. So that will only happen with a lease up. So those are pretty easy to identify, but otherwise, yeah, Jim's exactly right.
Great. One other question that came up and was actually +1. So a couple people are asking is around potential expansion outside of the U.S. market, particularly maybe in like Canada or other places.
Yeah.
Jonas, would you like to the boy from Toronto? Would you just like to talk about how disappointed your mom is that you're not covering?
She wants me to come home. Yeah. Canada would definitely be first on the international expansion list. But candidly, we've got a lot of work to do in the US to really capture the whole market and continue to do the good work we're doing here. Other markets around the world, each one has its own idiosyncratic rental market. Candidly, it's hard enough to manage New York City, which is a completely different, it might as well be Zimbabwe. It's that different from the rest of the United States from a rental standpoint. So just the domestic challenges are quite significant to get this data right. So we want to make sure we're tackling that effectively before we go international. But Canada will be the first stop when we go.
Awesome. And then you went a lot into the coverage, obviously, and talked about like how it's pretty well distributed. I'd be curious if there is any things researchers should think about in terms of, okay, if the data is sourced if it's mostly from professionally managed rentals, would that introduce any potential bias in the data in terms of geography or like level of income of the home, like renters or anything like that they should just be aware of when they're starting their research?
Yeah, so there are some quirks that emerge from the professionally managed character of it. And it's not just professionally managed, but it's people using professionally managed software, right? And again, that's about half the market. It is very representative of the rental prices being paid in the marketplace. There may be some difference between what individual mom and pops are doing versus the professionally managed folks, but in my experience, they're not that different from everything I can tell. There will be some quirks in the data. So, for example, I was talking to somebody a while back who wanted a data sample from this one particular neighborhood in Brooklyn, and it turned out that was a Hasidic neighborhood where nobody uses software to manage their property. So we just didn't have any data in that neighborhood at all. So there will be some quirks like that in the data, and there are certainly places where we have better and worse coverage. But we generally track where there's professionally managed properties.
Cool. And then we have one other question that kind of is relatively aligned with the question I was going to ask around like joining like potential other types of data or data sets this could be used in conjunction with really well. The question particularly is around, understanding if there's any information in the data set or that it could be joined with potentially around like the owners or the agents or like who are kind of part of the rental equation, and if that's something you guys are looking at or is in the data in some capacity, or maybe any guides to how we could potentially join to find that data in terms of like who would be the owners of these properties or the agents that are representing them.
Yeah. So we see people joining this data with a lot of other different types of data, and the standard join point today is the address.
Hmm.
To be able to map that in comparison to other data sets. One of the challenges of this space is that there is not a unique identifier today for rentals in this country. We're actually developing that. We have a unique rental unit identifier that we're working on right now and we'll be releasing later this year. So we're excited about that. But to date, there are some things out there like Place Key that can help connect single family homes or an apartment community as an entire building. But address has turned out to be the best join factor, particularly because we've done the work to actually find the address for the actual unit, and the rooftop geocoding for that is also, variant on that theme.
I can talk about owners too if you want. So this is a continual question. We do not have the owner information. Um, from what I've heard at conferences, I don't know that anybody truly does. They will always tell you, "Oh, we pierce the corporate veil, we do this whole thing." I feel like going back 15 plus years, maybe the companies went through a bunch of different iterations. And I don't know if this was driven by liability concerns or who knows what. They would split their property if they were vertically integrated and they had the ownership and investment as well as property management. They split those into two separate entities, right, to protect themselves, maybe to some extent, right? Like this is the ownership investment, this is a property management entity. Then you even saw, and I'm sure this happened beforehand, of breaking out individual properties into their own LLC type thing. Like it's become very foggy in terms. And then even when you look at those individual organizations trying to find who it truly is, this is the $1 million question we get at events all the time when people want to find acquisition opportunities and get to the owner. So the short answer is we don't have it. And the slightly longer version is I do not know that anybody truly has it out there. They purport to, but I've not seen one that does.
Yeah. We do identify in our data set the people who have listed the property. So in some cases, if you're interested in particular companies, an Equity Residential or an Invitation Homes or something like that, you will be able to see their portfolio in the data set. So that is, one venue to that. But yeah, it's the ownership issue is a really thorny one.
Yeah, the your comment around address matching is definitely something we're also thinking about, right? Because when we have a lot of real estate centric data sets on the platform, obviously that'd be a helpful addition to the Dewey platform is we make the join of those easy. And so I'll certainly be happy to collaborate on any sort of join keys you're doing there. We work, with PlaceKey a lot on a couple other data vendors, but I know there's been some changes to PlaceKey too in terms of who's managing that and maybe what their future is. So we're always interested in making ways to join data sets easier because yeah, the match on a address sometimes can be fuzzy depending on, street addresses and how you name them and things like that.
Yeah.
But I do think in terms of like some of I could see some of the, climate risk data sets we have on Dewey that are even just to a zip or, obviously Atom data, which has some of the, transaction flow on the property. Even Trackline is one of our partners that has actually like prices and survey data for like like dishwashers and AC units and things like that, just to understand the changes of prices of those in various regions and how that might affect rentals. I think there's a lot of cool opportunities to join. Cool. And then we have one question in the Q&A. It's going back to a bit of the differences between kind of the the sourced and scraped data sets versus the, data sets managed through the property managed source data sets and then the scraped data sets. It's kind of a question asking again about like a bit of the pros and cons, because obviously on the scrape side you have a chance to have significantly more number of records. I think we've talked about, duplicates and errors and issues in that. But I would say in terms of like, you know, I think we've touched on it a few times around the quality concern. Is there any difference in your mind in terms of like the attributes or the actual like columns or anything like that that can be captured on a property based on how the data is sourced?
Yes, I think the most important thing you have to know about scraped data is like we just did an analysis of one of the other ILSs, and we submitted inquiries at 50 other available units. 35 were not available and may have never been available. So it's not real data, it's fake data. So if somebody is then going out and scraping that site, which a lot of the scrapers use that particular site as a starting point, I'm not going to name names, but you can guess who. And the vast majority of the data is fictional. So is it made up accurately or is it made up inaccurately? I don't know. But it is not real data. So if you're relying on that, you're going to come to conclusions that have an unknown relationship with the truth. That's always been the challenge of scrape data. It's particularly so today, just because there is so much fraud that's developed over the last 10 years. The fraud in this space is so profitable that people are willing to pay for listings in order to defraud people.
Yeah.
Payment barrier used to be very effective against fraudsters, but it's not in this category because it is so profitable for the fraudsters. I would shy away very aggressively from using any scraped data because you're probably working with mostly false data.
I'll make one other quick comment. I was going to say it's anecdotal, but it's not. It's data driven. We analyzed Chattanooga, and in addition to what Jonas was saying, there were 5 listings that came up, same date, posted by the same person, different addresses, same asking rent, bedroom, bath count, same square footage that had been on Zillow for 97 days.
Yep.
When we did the scrape.
Yep.
They don't stay on the market that long. So that's the kind of stuff that takes place again when it's not locked down. That's professionally managed software system that's pushing to the platform.
I've seen brokers list the same unit with 250 addresses, 250 different addresses with the same photos and slightly different prices on the MLS.
Yeah.
The constraints that apply on the for sale side of the MLS do not apply on the rental side of the MLS. So the MLS, they only have about 3 to 5% of the rental inventory, and what they do have is really messy. That's why we don't use the MLS data at all.
Yeah.
It's not worth deduping.
Yeah. It's just lead gen for brokers then in that case, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the purpose that most rental listings serve, is lead gen for brokers. So if you want to measure lead gen for brokers, then yes, scrape data can be great. Lead gen for brokers and fraudsters.
Yeah.
That's the
It's its own research topic, maybe.
yeah, I could see wanting to study that. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I will say this is great to see all the questions come through. Obviously, there's some excitement about the data. We are going to reshare and kind of re-promote. So I'm sure this seminar, so I'm sure we'll get our own host of questions coming your way soon. But I really appreciate Jonas and Jim, you guys taking the time to chat with our team and some of our users. And again, we're super excited to have you guys as partners to move forward here, and definitely excited to see some of the research that comes out of this partnership. And again, I appreciate your offer to help and lean in. I'm sure you'll be hearing questions from us or from some of the users as we get this into the hands of more and more researchers. But I'll say thank you again, and I think we'll wrap it there. So I appreciate your time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Evan.
All righty, take
Yeah.
care.
Thank you, everybody.